Welcome back to another episode. Today, we'd like to talk about consumerism Christianity. And it's a little bit of a follow-up to our most recent episode. If you haven't heard it, go check it out. Where are you vulnerable? And part of the reason it's a follow-up is, especially here in the West, we live in a both subconscious and clever, sly consumerism and right in your face consumerism. So we're kind of getting pumped full of consumerism on both levels. And interestingly, I know in our last episode we just talked about, not talking about the church at large, not talking about people at large. And so just to sort of clarify, make the distinction, as we were talking about um, where are you vulnerable, I think it's the ego's tendency, it's the world's tendency, it's our flesh tendency to go get something to patch up that vulnerability, to go
Yeah.
to buy something or to learn a new skill or to gain something that the gaining of it gives us access to what we needed all along. And you and I were talking just before we started recording about the definition of a consumer. Do you still have that pulled up by
Oh,
chance?
yeah, I do. A person who purchases goods and services for personal use.
Mm. And interesting that the last bit says personal use.
Yeah.
Um, I guess full transparency. I I entered into Christianity with the same guys, frankly. Growing up sort of in and around the church, but at the time, faith never really served me. And I hate to say it like that, but
Yeah.
such a sort of looking out for myself approach to the world and to life was, if this thing doesn't bring value to me, there's no point in it. And I had largely looked at God the same way. And really, part of the reason that I even entered back into the fold, so to speak, was at a time in my life where I was, struggling with direction, struggling with what to do and who to be, and being faced with some of the worst parts of myself. I really did enter in as though, all right, let me buy this package and get what comes with it, you
Yeah.
know? And so to just, I wanted to kind of dedicate an episode to clarifying and distinguishing between when the Lord points out where you're vulnerable and what it means uh, to gain through subtraction rather than to gain through addition and purchase, and why that is the system of the other father, and how that has filtered its way from the garden all the way through into our, largely consumeristic society today. So I guess before
Well,
I dive into that, what do you have on your brain?
that system is based on lack.
Hmm.
The
Yep.
subconscious, as you said. In fact, if you go to any marketing seminar or even marketing degree in college, that they are uh, fooling people into believing there's a lack and that they have to have this thing to fulfill it.
Yep.
And so the whole system, as you said, is the system of the other father,
Mm,
that you're lacking something, so go find it and fill
yep.
it.
Yep. Yeah.
And
And
that
that's
is not the system of our father.
well, right. And that's why, when we talked previously about the comfort that we desire, or think we desire rather, that so much of it has to do with the consumer comfort habits.
Yeah.
And again, not everyone has those. I mean, I know I mentioned a couple of them, but it's, to your point, the whole system is based on lack. And in fact, you could argue that the fallen world that we live in is based on lack. And
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, when he came, he didn't recognize death and he didn't recognize lack. And
Mm-hmm.
him multiplying bread and food, you know, again, several layers to everything. It's really easy to focus on the miracle that is the physical multiplication of food. And yet, one of the layers is Jesus's recognition of this tiny thing that he has in front of him in his hand. If that's what's in front of him, then it's all that he needs right now.
Mm.
If this is what is your portion, and I think of there's a Disney Pixar movie called Onward, and one of the lessons, one of the themes that keeps coming up is he says, you know, on a journey like this, you got to just use what you got. And I think about how we are so trained and programmed from a societal standpoint that we inherently don't have things. And we have to go gain skills. We have to go learn this, become that. And again, I'm not refuting the fact that there's truth in it. And yet, if we use the example of the garden, the rose seed doesn't become anything other than a rose bush. And to say that the seed doesn't contain all that it already needs to become that bush, that is, I think, part of why the first sin was so grave in the Father's eyes, was the inherent belief that something that he had endowed was lacking and
Mm.
that it could be improved upon. I mean, think about
Yeah.
genetically modified foods, where at
Yeah.
first it was an actual wholesome attempt from science to be able to provide in places that they can't grow those crops, or for some of the less affluent people. And yet, what it's morphed into is, well, let's improve on nature's design, as though
Mm-hmm.
nature hasn't had a million years to practice and perfect its design. And
Yeah.
even before that, as though the creator didn't create it to perfect its design. And so when we're talking about consumerism in Christianity, I think in a lot of ways, and I've done this probably countless times myself, I ask God to give me something, to make me something, to I'm trying to find the words so that I don't use multiple words and have to change the definition, but it's it's the addition. I need knowledge, I need wisdom, and I'm not refuting the fact that those things are true. I mean, in Proverbs, it explicitly says, cry out for wisdom. So,
Yeah.
so I'm not knocking that. Understand that I'm saying I was asking it from a place of lack and from a place of my incompleteness, a heart position of incompleteness. I'm asking him to complete me. And I think we've talked about this verse before, but where Paul says his answer to me was, my grace is sufficient. And how that translates to us is the great exchange has happened. The gift has been given. The seed has been planted. The price has been paid. The new heart and the new spirit, the born again process has taken place. And
Yes.
so, what you're asking me for, you're asking from a standpoint that that isn't done and something needs to happen in order to do it. And that's why he can't answer that prayer in that way. And in fact, he's told me before explicitly, I won't participate in the system of another father. And so
Mm.
it is different, but to understand and on some level learn to appreciate that, like I said, going back to the garden, he convinced them, and this is after God said, let us make man in our image. So it's already made in God's image. And then the serpent is able to convince them that in doing something, they'll become like God. They already were.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, part of the difficulty of accepting the fullness of the gift that he's given us is, and in fact, that's part of what I have up in my verse for today, is that just just tell me what to do. Just
Yeah.
give me the playbook of what I can bring to the party, to the trading system, what value that I can give you in order for you to give this value of being like God to me. And ultimately, again, I know I've referenced it a couple times. When I say the system of another father, part of the reason that Satan was kicked out of heaven, Lucifer, the angel, was banished, was that he was exchanging the glory of God, which he had been given and shared with him. He was exchanging it for loyalty. He was exchanging it for service. And then when humans fell, he believed that that act of trading the glory that he had convinced them to do was worthy of them being killed for all time. And so anyways, that system is the nature of not accepting the Father's judgment or his word or his value system, but choosing one for yourself, choosing his value system where you value power over humility, where you or value control over peace. And in that same system comes, you are lacking, give me money, which I value, and I'll give you the thing that you're lacking. It inherently creates the necessity that, as we've talked about, the necessity of the different parts of the system that he's created is like an ecosystem. It's a bountiful necessity where consumerism and lack have crept in is it's a zero sum game. It is a
Yeah.
negative necessity where you're not complete until this thing happens.
Yeah. I'm thinking of John 10:10. I've come to
Mm,
give you life and life more abundant, right? That is the ecosystem of his life is
mm,
all abundance all the time. And
yep.
like you said, the exchange has already taken place.
Mm,
Now, what in order to stand in that fully and in all circumstances, it's a process to
yeah.
learn and step out of the programming that we have from the consumerism, the other father, the world
Right.
systems that are in place. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, and it's funny you say it that way. I think that there's a little part of me that I'll say rejects the notion of a process. And I think that
Mm,
while that's coming from a maybe spirit rooted place that says it's already done, you know what I mean?
yeah.
It's like the
Yeah.
journey could be 11 days. It doesn't have to be 40 years. The journey could be you die and you accept that death. But I think that it's coming up actually and out through an ego porthole and turning into the rejection of the process. Because again, the concept of a process in eternity is almost moot. It becomes
Yeah.
irrelevant. And so I think that that is an area to play off the last one where perhaps I'm still vulnerable is the acceptance of, the beauty almost in the fact that the Lord knows, let's just say I'm going to be on the earth for 100 years. How glorious that in my first 31 years, he didn't reveal all that there was to see.
Yeah.
We read in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he says, I kept nothing from myself, no desire that I had that I didn't do. And I got to tell you, it's all feeding on hot air. It's all chasing the wind. It is, I've done everything and I'm still bored and I'm still miserable. And I say that again, both for the ego example, but then even not as an ego, as a spirit being a child here, there's beauty in the long-term process of discovering. There's beauty in
Mm,
having 100 years of life so that you can have 100 years of life, not so that you could have 10 years of life done over and done over and done over and done over. And so
yeah.
I do think that the process is a two-way street where he does take you at the pace of your soul, and sometimes you're on an accelerated path, but he also loves you and cherishes you and wants purposefully to walk it out with you over time. Because as we said in the last episode, you'll come to realize that the intertwined walking with him is actually the thing you thought you wanted the whole time. And his
Well, he
patience to
likens,
teach you that.
yeah. Well, he likens our walk with him or this life like a marriage, right? And
Mm,
would you
mm-hmm.
just be satisfied in a marriage if you're like, okay, we've got this certificate, so
See ya.
see you later? It's like you live it out, right?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
so yeah, when we say
Exactly.
process, sometimes our ego can say like, I've got to become something, or I've got to,
Consumerism.
walk across the
Mm-hmm.
stage. But the process is, hey, this is like a marriage, a relationship, a participation in
Mm,
a journey.
yep.
And I think you've said that before. The journey would be kind of boring if everything was, the
Gravy.
journey is the obstacle, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, and I know I've been kind of fixated on the nature examples, so I suppose forgive me, but when you think about the the tree and in that tiny little acorn is all that it needs to become the largest oak tree in the forest. They're made of the same exact thing. And so
Hmm.
the process, if you will, of becoming that tree is actually the thing that's beautiful. It's not the just being a seed or just being a tree.
Yeah.
And the if you think about the moment of being a seed and the final moment of being a tree before being cut down, those two are actually the slivers in time compared to the whole entire trunk from the base all the way up to the tip. And we spend, I have historically spent far too much time focused on that tiny little sliver that is the end of being a tree, that final moment. And in essence, what it's done is rob me of enjoying the process of becoming that tree. And
Yeah.
so to recognize that, and I know it's again cliche almost, love the process, and I think I'm averse to those words because of how mainstream they've become, but
Hmm.
to really enjoy the fact that I am this, I don't know why I keep saying it, I am this rose bush, and every year I'll be a little bit more rose bushy. Every year
Yeah.
there will be a couple more blooms. There will be maybe a few more birds that make their nest in me, a closer beehive. One year we'll have really hard rains. One year will be really dry. And yet to bear fruit in all seasons is part of the promise of being a tree in his garden. And I think that to me again is part of the glory of what Jesus has done is no matter in which garden of all creation you were, through Jesus, the moment you believe, you got lift clean and placed immediately into this garden, into this soil. And the process of establishing new roots here and growing in this environment, that does take time. But again, it's not as though the time is against you until you become something. The time is the part that you get to grow together in that marriage. You
Mm,
spend 40 years in a marriage to have had 40 long, beautiful years of time spent with someone.
yeah.
And in that same vein, we have that relation with him now, which is pretty neat, in my opinion.
Yeah. I I love that you brought up the rose, you said fruit, but in the rose's case, it's a flower,
Hmm.
uh, but if think of a fruit tree, consumerism says go find fruit, pick the fruit, find the fruit, give me the fruit.
Uh-huh.
And the kingdom system is, oh yeah, you're a fruit tree. You will grow fruit.
You'll
It's
bear fruit.
inevitable. You will
Yes,
bear fruit, but it's going to be a different kind of way. I'm
totally.
going to, like you said
Mm,
earlier, I'm going to get your roots in.
yeah.
I'm going to get your stock, you know, I'm going to
Hmm.
fill you out. I'm going to prune off branches that might be causing problems,
Hmm.
but inevitably you will bear fruit.
Yeah. Well, and gosh, I love that you brought that up. Um, the the bearing of fruit, I think, is partly what is so contrary and seems hard to us compared to the consumerism system. Because
Yeah.
in the consumer system, if I have 100 grand and what I need costs 20 grand, I can go get it right now. I don't
Yeah.
have to wait. And I was thinking, I don't know if I brought this up yet, but I was thinking about this little cactus that we have planted outside our front
Uh,
yard. Um, and he's a tiny little guy, maybe a foot tall. And the first 2 years that we've had him, this is now our third year, the first 2 years he produced a flower. And it was this like beautiful orange blossom flower with tons and tons of petals. It looked super exotic. I really enjoyed it. And then this year, after we got our final snow, and I shouldn't say final, it could always still snow here in Colorado, but we got a final snow maybe a month ago. And after that, in the coming weeks, he now has 7 flowers and three
mm.
tiny little cactus nodes all at his base. And I think the Lord was sort of using that as this analogy for me of in the third year of this being planted, it's really starting to bloom. And and the idea of, our attachment to time and what we think it's going to look like when it blooms and how it should and when it should and where it should, so much of that stuff I won't even say is irrelevant, but borderline offensive to the Father, who so rejoices at taking good care of his garden and will make you into a beautiful tree for his name's sake, that the concept of bearing that fruit, like nothing changed on the outside of this cactus between last year and this year. And once it did change, it was, oh, wow, this cactus has 7 flowers. Really easy to get noticed if you're a cactus with 7 flowers, but does that mean that you're less of a cactus those first 2 years that you bear one flower? And so that
Yeah.
concept of this cactus didn't go get anything to become new. Yes, it's true. The sunlight, the soil, and the water that it needed over these last 3 years has accumulated into what it is now. And that's intertwining ourselves with the Lord, getting daily our bread, daily the sunshine, the sunshine, the water, the good soil that we need. And yet it's that, as we're talking about that relationship over time, not the consumer go get love. And in fact, I think that's a good time to sort of read the verse I had picked out. We're in Luke 10, verse 25 through 37. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan,
Mm.
but specifically the beginning. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What must I do? And it's a
Mhm.
lawyer asking him this. The lawyer represents not only the law, but the way of the world, if you will, the justice and the system of the world that says, what do I do from the other father's perspective? And Jesus says, well, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. And so I think about how, again, Jesus's words are do this. And yet the instructions given at that time in Torah to us in the Bible, loving the Lord, how do you do that? You
Yeah.
know what I mean? You can't do that unless you get to know the Lord in the case you're talking about as a marriage and say, how do you like to be loved? What does it mean to love you? What does that
Mhm.
look like? What does this relationship look like? And I go back again historically to my transactional approach to relationships, and I had no interest in loving the Lord. I just said that I did because that's part of what I do to gain eternal life. It's that consumer nature in me that says, I don't actually want to change. I don't really want a relationship. I don't need you. What I want is what you have so that I can feel complete. And
Mm.
the Lord was so gracious with me to, when I say that now, I feel how offensive that is. And if you said that you did that to a person, it would be understandable if they didn't want to continue a relationship with you. And yet, for him to be so gracious and even knowing that that's why I came to him in the first place, I think
He
of
doesn't care.
kindness leads them to repentance, not
Yeah.
the other way around.
Yeah.
And him loving on me and changing my life the long way so that it's sustainable as I've attempted and practice and more been intertwined with him, that far surpasses the reasons that I thought I came in the
Yeah.
first place. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Man, too funny. Um, so we are uh, running close on time. So before we dive into what's bubbling up, did you have any thoughts about what we've talked about so far to
Well,
to wrap us up?
we kind of talked about Psalm 1 verse 3.
Okay.
Um we kind of talked about this before, but I think this is a good description of the opposite of consumerism, and
Okay.
the programming of lack that we sometimes have to break off of us.
Hmm.
But he talks about a righteous man, which we are. We've been given
Mm-hmm.
the gift of righteousness. So he will be like a tree planted by the streams of water, which yield its fruit in its season, and its leaves does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers.
Mm,
So the idea of having to go strive and get all that for yourselves versus
mm,
allowing him to take you the long way,
mm-hmm.
which ultimately isn't really the long way, because even those that get it the other way, they end up, it
How many
almost makes
countless
them,
stories
well, it
of
makes them
people who
stumble. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
So it might be the long way, but it's the right way, if
Mm-hmm.
the righteous way, his way, which really, you know, whatever you do prospers,
Yeah.
when it's coming up and out of your identity versus grabbing it externally,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
it
funny.
will be prosperous.
Even the concept of a long way. I know we've joked about in the past, like our idea of time, to the Lord, 1,000 years counts as a day.
Yeah.
So us taking 20 years to do something, he's like, please. But he also gets that we're made of dust. And if 20 years is a fifth of our life, he gets that.
Yeah.
But the reason I say it is, I think about the way that he builds, and just thinking of Legos, you can take that the main Lego, the little eight topper, and you could just stack those, and you could keep stacking them, and you could get a really tall structure that way. And yet, if at any point someone comes by and just flicks in the middle with their finger, the whole structure's coming down. Top half's crumbling, and hard does that tree fall, and then the whole middle section's tumbling too. The way that the Lord works is to really build a foundation. Like he's
Hmm.
the master architect. He's going to build a skyscraper that no matter what the environment throws at it, it's going to stick there. And so that concept of, again, the long way is really only in comparison to the quick way.
Yeah.
And the quick way is called that for a reason, because usually things that come quickly leave just as quickly. And how many countless examples of people who reach the highest heights of success and say, yeah, I got it all, and then I was miserable. So I'm telling you, money doesn't make you happy. And we're over like, yeah, easy to say, you've got all that money. And they're like, dude, I'd give it to you. And you would see that you're happy for 6 months, and then you're miserable again.
Yeah.
And so that's I think a good segue. What kind of bubbles up for me from this episode, if you can take something away from it, is I think it's our default to our brain is literally wired to correct error. Um, and I think about it from a righteous perspective, that how he made Adam originally in the garden, how he made himself. If there's anything wrong, we fix it, we heal it, it get
Yeah.
back to harmony. But knowing that we're so far removed from the garden, and that our tendency, our brain's wiring to pick out the mistakes, to notice the errors, to notice what needs fixing, can really, really play into the consumeristic approach, and to always thinking you need something new from God. You need a new lesson, a new this, a new that. And I say this as someone who is actively walking through changing my words in my prayer from that. And so
Mm.
I wish I could sit here and say, this is exactly what to say instead. I think a good starting point is, be unto me according to your word, because that really puts me in the mindset that this has already happened. And as I die, as I participate, the rose bush grows. And
Mm.
so to have patience with myself during that growth process, but to recognize that every time I have the urge to consume more of God and consume Jesus, not from the standpoint of he is the bread of life and I should eat of him every day. I mean, consume in the way that that definition said, for personal use, as
Yeah.
though this transaction, the gaining from God, is so that my life is better, my time is improved, my power is increased, whatever that thing is that you think you need. I'm not saying that your needs are false. I'm not saying that what's in your life right now is not immediate and necessary and pressing, but just that on a higher level, the things he delivers to us, the miracles he delivers to us. Yeah, you might need rent money, but
Yeah.
it's not coming from lack, and he's making you complete with that rent money. He's learning to show you, or rather, he's teaching you that that came from the fruit of the tree that you are, to handle a component of your life. And as you can tell, that was by no means a graceful description of all that's going on. Again, more evidence that I'm currently walking through it. So hopefully on a future episode, I will have an update for you guys on how that's going and how I might articulate it then. But that's what's standing out to me. When you do have the urge to need something added to you, it might be an invitation to recognize the Father's given it to you. And as you lean into him, as you discover it for yourself, You don't need to collect more dots of data. You need to connect the dots of data that are
Oh,
already within you.
that's good. Yeah, that's a good summary.
What about you?
Awesome. Well, yeah, when you were saying I don't quite, your prayers change.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Um, Having walked with the Lord just a little bit longer, I don't ask him for a lot of specific stuff anymore.
Mm,
I
mm-hmm.
I thank him for handling situations I may be challenged with. I
Yep.
thank him for showing his strength, you know, in
Mm-hmm.
through me in
Mm,
facing this or that.
yeah.
Um, but your prayers change. They're not consumer type prayers where you
Yeah.
come with a shopping list
An
and say,
agenda.
yeah, and
Uh-huh.
oh, do this, it's that's just what I thought of. Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
perfect.
Well, blessings to everyone. Thanks for tuning in for another one.
Awesome. Thanks.